I'm Francesca Fleur, and you're watching Hammerson Peters. In this video, we're going to take a look at an ancient and unsettling legend, which appears in both Old and New World folklore.
For millennia, Indigenous peoples all over Canada have told campfire stories about strange little men with magical abilities who lived in the mountains. The Inuit of the high Arctic, for example, spoke of shape-shifting elves from the islands of the Arctic archipelago. The Kaska of northern British Columbia, on the other hand, have tales of mountain-dwelling dwarfs who could conjure powerful winds, and the interior Salish tribes of southern British Columbia spoke of tiny men who delighted in tricking humans with optical illusions.
Eerily, very similar traditions exist among certain Euro-Canadian settler societies. Just as European cultures differ from those of Canada's First Nations, the Little People of settler legend have certain Old World characteristics which distinguish them from their Indigenous cousins. These differences hint at two hair-raising possibilities: that a belief in imaginary Little People is some mysterious quality inherent to human beings, or that human beings aren't the only European immigrants to settle in Canada.
From the nymphs of ancient Greek mythology, through the elves and dwarves of Germanic legend, to the fairies of Celtic folklore, little people with preternatural abilities, who live in the wilderness and on the fringes of the civilized world, concealed from mortal eyes by some other dimensional veil from which they rarely emerge, have been staples of European folk tradition for millennia. To the modern mind, this element of European folklore is the quintessence of fiction, the story in which it is incorporated the epitomical tall tale. Fairy tales are imaginary stories we tell to children, or a designation we apply to narratives that are too preposterous to believe. Elves and dwarves populate our literary and cinematic fantasies. To our European ancestors, however, little people were very real neighbors, who could confer good luck if treated with respect, and wreak terrible mischief if provoked. Little people stories are not unique to the Old World. For centuries, European immigrants to Canada have reported strange experiences on their homesteads and in the wilderness beyond their farmhouses, which mirror the little people tales of their homeland. Folklorists attribute these reports to the importation of little people beliefs into Canada, contending that the settlers who disclosed them drew upon the folklore of their ancestors, in an effort to interpret bizarre phenomena for which no rational explanations readily presented themselves. Many Euro-Canadian pioneers, on the other hand, unhesitatingly attributed the strange events from which such reports derived to the machinations of little people, firmly maintaining that their mysterious, diminutive Old World neighbors had followed or accompanied them across the Atlantic and taken up residence outside their own settlements. The first written records of little people in Canada are arguably the Greenlanders saga and the saga of Eric the Red, medieval texts describing 10th century Icelandic Greenlandic Viking voyages to Canada's Atlantic Northeast, known collectively as the Icelandic sagas. Both of these texts describe Norse encounters with diminutive, fur-clad natives, whom the Vikings called Skrælingjar, with whom the explorers traded and battled. Although many historians argue that the Skrælingjar were likely the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, the more ancient Dorset people whom the Thule displaced, or perhaps the ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq First Nations, some of the abilities and behaviors with which the sagas ascribed them were distinctly inhuman. Specifically, in the saga of Eric the Red, a party of Norse explorers attempted to capture a family of Skrælingjar they came across on their return journey to Greenland. Although they managed to capture 2 children, a Skraeling man and 2 women escaped them by disappearing down holes in the earth. The Skraeling children, after learning the Norse language, later explained that their people did not live in houses, but rather dwelled in caves or holes in the ground, much like the dwarves of medieval Germanic legend. Another dwarf-like creature which made its appearance in the sagas was the One-Footer, a stunted, one-legged monster which hopped from place to place, referenced in the writings of the classical Greeks and Romans. According to the saga of Eric the Red, the Norsemen who captured the Skraeling children were attacked by a One-Footer shortly after the kidnapping operation. The creature shot their leader in the lower abdomen with an arrow but failed to kill him, and hopped away before any of the Vikings could exact vengeance. In the 1870s, nearly 900 years after the Viking voyages described in the sagas, Iceland was rocked by a series of devastating volcanic eruptions, droughts, and ovine epidemics, which rendered the island country all but inhospitable. Encouraged by agents of the Alvin Shipping Line, a Scots-Canadian steamship company which had recently opened an office in Reykjavik, thousands of Icelanders fled the land of fire and ice and immigrated to the Great White North, following in the shadowy wake of the longships that their Dark Age ancestors sailed to the New World. Prompted by generous land grants arranged at the behest of Lord Dufferin, the Governor-General of Canada, many Icelandic Canadians gradually gravitated to a stretch of Manitoban prairie on the southwestern shores of Lake Winnipeg, which would come to be known as New Iceland. Ever since, Manitoba has boasted the highest population of ethnic Icelanders outside Iceland. In the summers of 1966, 1967, and 1969, an Icelandic-Canadian folklorist named Magnus Einarsson traveled throughout New Iceland and the rest of Western Canada for the purpose of collecting Icelandic-Canadian folklore. Throughout the course of his travels, he sat down with 98 Icelandic-Canadian old-timers and recorded all the local stories and traditions they wished to share with him. Einarsson made 462 recordings, which wound up in the archives of the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. In 1991, Einarsson transcribed 175 of his recordings and published them under the title Icelandic-Canadian Oral Narratives. Magnus Einarsson's collection of Icelandic-Canadian folktales reveals a strong belief in ghosts, second sight, the power of dreams, and the supernatural among the mid-20th century Icelandic Canadians of south-central Manitoba. What I eventually found in the way of stories came as a surprise to me, Einarsson wrote of his findings in an introduction to his book. I did not expect to find people to tell me fairy tales or tall tales. I most certainly did not expect to find so many good humorous anecdotes, and I didn't expect to find alive such a keen and pervasive interest in dreams and ghostly visions. Amid tales of hauntings and premonitions, Einarsson's book contains a handful of anecdotes pertaining to the Ulvar, or Huldufolk, literally hidden people, elusive elves of Icelandic folklore who live inside rocks, atop cliffs, or within hills. The belief in elves has had a stubborn death in Iceland, Einarsson wrote in a footnote to one of his stories. The folklorist went on to explain that the Huldufolk are said to look, speak, and act like humans, but are believed to be of an essentially different nature. Contact with the Huldufolk, according to his informants, was a rare and potentially dangerous occurrence in the wilds of New Iceland. These mysterious entities sometimes attempted to kidnap human children and steal household objects. Huldufolk would occasionally approach humans and entreat them for help, and would confer luck or bestow particular skills upon their assistants as a reward for their kindness. Because elves are so bound up with a particular type of rocky topography, Einarsson wrote, there are not many reports of them being sighted in the New World, but the belief in them is, nevertheless, quite strong, especially among the older generation." Unquote. He elaborated on the beliefs of the old-timers he interviewed in another footnote, writing, quote, "In the New Iceland settlement of Manitoba, on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, there seems to be a greater readiness, at least among some of the older people, to see the environment in the traditional way, as having a fourth, usually unseen dimension, than there is in some of the more recent settlements in Saskatchewan." Unquote. 4 of the Huldufolk stories in Einarsson's book are set in Iceland, the birthplace of the respective storytellers. The first of these was told by Mrs. Sigurdis Thorsteinsson, an elderly farm wife who lived outside the town of Arborg, Manitoba. Mrs. Thorsteinsson heard the tale from an old man named Fusi, who would often tell her about, quote, all sorts of things that happened in Iceland, unquote. Fusi's father, Svein, had been a physician back in Iceland. One night many years ago, a strange man knocked on his door and asked him if he would help deliver a baby. Svein agreed. After gathering his coat, hat, and medical kit, the doctor stepped outside to find 2 horses tethered to his fence, one of which was apparently intended for him. Before mounting, the stranger insisted that the doctor blindfold himself, assuring him that he would guide his horse to their destination. Mystified, Svein did as requested. They had traveled a long way, Mrs. Thorsteinsson said, and he said it had almost seemed to him as if they were going up the side of a mountain. And then, when they had gone quite a long way, he took the handkerchief from his eyes, unquote. Svein found himself at the mouth of a small cave, into which the mysterious guide ushered him. Inside, he found a woman in labor, whom he promptly assisted. Due to Svein's ministrations, the delivery was a success. Before dawn, the healthy newborn was sleeping soundly in the arms of his mother. When he was satisfied that his assistance was no longer required, the physician prepared to leave. As he rose from his seat, the new mother informed him that, quote, he would never fail in helping a woman give birth to a child, unquote. Svein returned home in the same manner in which he had arrived, blindfolded, his horse guided by his mysterious supplicant. He went on to enjoy a long and distinguished medical career, and, just as the woman predicted, he never failed in his perinatal duties. The second Huldufolk story, set in Iceland, was related by Mrs. Sigrun Thorgrimsson, a housewife from Winnipeg, Manitoba. It revolves around Christian Christiansen, a member of a large family from Skagafjordur, a region in northern Iceland characterized by a deep fjord and its valley, and the only county in the country where horses outnumber people. One spring day, when Christian was 4 years old, he and his siblings were playing beneath a crag that overlooked the family farmhouse. And it was a peculiar crag, Mrs. Thorgrimsson disclosed. They said it looked like a church. When the children finally returned home, it was discovered that Christian was not among them. A frantic search ensued, but no matter how thoroughly they looked, the family members could find neither hide nor hair of the missing child. And there was no hazard that they could imagine, Mrs. Thorgrimsson said. Neither Brooks nor anything that he could have fallen into. So they searched until evening, but the boy wasn't found, and everyone naturally was chilled by fear and sorrow, unquote. Christian's mother, Gudrun Sigurdardóttir, tossed and turned all night. The family resumed their search at first light the following morning, scouring the fields for any sign of the missing boy. Their efforts were for naught. It seemed as if Christian had vanished into thin air. The rescue party finally retired to the farmhouse after sundown that night, the gathering gloom heralding the arrival of another dread-filled night. It was with a heavy heart that Gudrun set about preparing the evening meal for her weary family, now bafflingly short one member. She made her way to the pantry and opened the door, only to find little Christian standing on the other side, quote, tear-stained, weak, and downhearted, unquote. Elated, Gudrun related the good news to her husband and children, who immediately crowded around the 4-year-old and asked him where he had been. A woman took me, Christian explained, but I cried so much that she didn't want to keep me any longer, unquote. And that's all they ever got out of him, Mrs. Thorgrimsson concluded. No one knows to this day where the child was during this time. Everyone, of course, thought that he had been with the elves in the crags, unquote. Interestingly, the ideas implicit in this story accord with an old tradition of the Dene and Woodland Cree of northern Canada, which contends that a race of supernatural dwarves, with a penchant for kidnapping, inhabit the rocky crags along rivers. Another tale of attempted Huldufolk abduction in Iceland was told by Mr. Bjorn Bjarnason, a farmer from the village of Arborg, Manitoba. This tale, which Mr. Bjarnason learned from his father, takes place in Iceland's rugged northwestern corner. An incident occurred, Mr. Bjarnason began, in which a child, a girl, started complaining that there was a woman who came and wanted to take her away, but she didn't want to go with the woman, unquote. One day, while working outside, the girl's mother heard an alarming noise from the farmhouse and rushed inside to investigate. She found her daughter floating in mid-air at about shoulder height. As soon as she arrived, the child fell to the floor. At that moment, Mr. Bjarnason said, a gust of wind or some gust of air passes by her and seemed to disappear, unquote. Following the incident, the mother sought the services of a renowned clairvoyant named John. Although John was an elderly man who preferred to keep his journeys short, he agreed to travel to the farmhouse to investigate the matter. He arrived at the farm one evening and announced that he would begin his work the following morning. Unfortunately, the clairvoyant died in his sleep that very night, leaving the mystery unsolved. The fourth and final Iceland-based Huldufolk story that Einarsson included in his book was related by Mr. Gunnar Alexander, a fisherman from Arborg, Manitoba. Mr. Alexander explained that, when he was 10 years old, he worked as a shepherd's assistant in eastern Iceland. One day, he headed out on an errand, taking a trail that wound along the slopes of a mountain. On the way, he spied 3 beautiful girls standing near a large rock some distance from the trail. I think to myself, Alexander said, that it would be nice to talk to them, and I turn off the path." Unquote. In his haste to approach the strangers, Alexander tripped and fell to the ground. "And when I looked up," he said, "everything was in a fog. They were beautiful, boy." Unquote. In addition to the stories above described, Einarsson included 5 fairy tales set in Manitoba, which demonstrate a belief, shared by certain Icelandic Canadian old-timers, that some Huldufolk had followed their ancestors to Canada. The first of these was related by Mr. Hallgrimur Staffeld from the community of Riverton, Manitoba. In a footnote, Einarsson explained that the incident described, quote, "took place at the farm of Reinestad, in northern New Iceland, on Lake Winnipeg," unquote, and that, quote, "there had been 2 or 3 similar incidents prior to this one," unquote. One day when he was a boy, Mr. Staffeld's son, Kjartan, was watching over the family's sheep flock when he was suddenly and unexpectedly approached by a woman who was dressed in a traditional Icelandic woman's costume. The woman beckoned for Kjartan to follow her, and the boy, in a daze, obeyed. They had gone about a half-mile toward the shores of Lake Winnipeg, Staffeld said, when at last he sort of came to, wondering where he was going, unquote. Startled, Kjartan looked around for the woman and discovered that he was alone. The boy returned home and relayed his adventure to his mother. Upon hearing Kjartan's description of the woman, Mrs. Staffeld concluded that she must have been an elf, and that she had attempted to lure her son to the water. 3 Canadian Huldufolk tales in Einarsson's book involve the elves' alleged propensity to appropriate random household items for their own mysterious purposes. The first of these tales was told by Miss Margaret Bjarnason, the sister of the aforementioned Bjorn Bjarnason, who kept house for the latter. Einarsson interviewed the siblings together in their Arberg farmhouse in August 1967. Whenever Margaret did the laundry, she hung her and her brother's wet clothes on a clothesline outside. She maintained this practice even in winter, and would wear a pair of mittens when spreading out the laundry during the colder months of the year. "I was going to hang out some socks," she said, "and then I discovered that my gloves had disappeared, and it didn't matter where I looked, I couldn't find them." Unquote. Time passed and Margaret forgot about the missing mittens. A year later, she said, "I find them lying in the clothespin box where I had always kept them, and naturally I had often opened this little box. The hidden people had returned them." Unquote. Miss Bjarnason never outright acknowledged a belief in elves, and confessed to Einarsson that she was unsure of whether or not they existed. She went on to suggest that most of the older people she knew definitely seemed to believe in them. After relating the tale of the missing mittens, Margaret Bjarnason prompted her brother to tell Einarsson about his own brush with the Huldufolk. Bjorn explained that, one day, he went down to the basement to tackle some household chore, which required the use of his knife. Once he completed the task, he searched for the leather sheath in which he always kept his knife, but was unable to find it anywhere. "I made a determined effort to search in a bed that was there," he said, "and all around it, and under it, and it was all for naught. And I went and got my sister, and we searched again where we could, although we had no idea where the thing might be. It wasn't found, so I said we shouldn't bother with it anymore, that it was pointless. But a year later, or very close to it, I had some business down in the basement." Unquote. Bjorn went downstairs to work on this project, and found his knife's leather sheath lying atop the neatly made-up bed. Like his sister, Bjorn expressed an open-mindedness regarding the existence of the Huldufolk, but accepted them, quote, "as a possibility in the framework of spiritualism," unquote, rather than in the, quote, "framework of traditional belief," unquote. If you drive an hour north of the city of Winnipeg, along the western shores of Lake Winnipeg, you'll come to the town of Gimli, Manitoba. Dubbed the heart of New Iceland, this Icelandic Canadian enclave is a setting of what is undoubtedly the most famous Huldufolk tale in Canada. A modern-day saga which, like all good fairy tales, teeters on the border separating charming fantasy from unsettling credibility. The story revolves around Gimli's Town Hall, an enchanting 106-year-old building which was initially employed as a public schoolhouse. The window that sits directly above the building's main entrance is surmounted by a decorative arch composed of 3 large trapezoidal limestone bricks, the middle of which is missing. The conspicuous mortar-encrusted depression in which the stone was once set serves as a reminder of a seemingly unremarkable event which initiated Gimli's most famous fairy tale. One day in 1975, the above-mentioned stone unexpectedly fell from the school's exterior wall, nearly braining a female teacher who had been standing in the doorway. Many Gimli residents who still adhered to the traditions of their ancestors suspected that the close call might be attributable to the mischief of the Huldufolk, whom Icelandic folklore contends live inside rocks, such as those which adorned the school's entrance. Due to safety concerns, the local Evergreen School Division decided to close the school, unwilling to make the renovations necessary to bring the building up to code. As local legend would have it, the school board's refusal to renovate the edifice stemmed less from a preclusive budget than from a reluctance to risk offending the little people, a potential consequence of such a project. In 1987, the new school council, apparently unencumbered by their predecessors' fear of elfish repercussions, decided to demolish the historic structure, prompting a coalition of townspeople to launch a campaign aimed at designating the abandoned school a municipal heritage site. Demolition was delayed, and a series of unproductive council meetings ensued. In 1990, the crusade to save the school gained a new and powerful recruit. Dr. Leo Christiansen, the 58-year-old freshly retired president of the University of Saskatchewan, who had just attained membership in the Order of Canada for his academic services, was dismayed when he learned that his childhood school was scheduled for an indefinite appointment with the Wrecking Ball. Out of the blue, to the amusement of some and the astonishment of others, Christiansen publicly came forward with a fantastic personal story, which imbued the old building with a new aura of mystery and magic. The school was indeed inhabited by Huldufolk, Christiansen maintained, as many Gimli old-timers had long suspected. He knew this because two of the elves, named Snorri and Snæbjorn, had introduced themselves to him when he was a student there. These Huldufolk had initially made their home on the second story of Tyrgesson's General Store, the oldest of its kind still in operation in Manitoba, which was built in the heart of Gimli in 1899. When the store's second floor was removed in the 1920s, the little people took up residence in the attic of the newly constructed brick schoolhouse. Every once in a while, they would descend from their hideaway and play tricks on teachers and students, borrowing books, stationery, and other school equipment which struck their fancy. On crisp autumn mornings in the 1930s and 40s, when Christiansen attended the Gimli Public School, the elves would often sit at the attic window and watch young Leo walk over from his house across the street. The Huldufolk took a liking to Leo, and decided to make themselves known to him one day. Over the next few years, the student would have several more encounters with the little people, who would sometimes answer his questions regarding their backstory. Snorri and Snæbjorn were pranksters, and Christiansen was certain it was they who had dislodged the stone from the school wall in 1975. In nearly any other Canadian community, Leo Christiansen's tale would have been received as nothing more than a playful attempt to inject some local color into a dry and flagging historic preservation campaign. In Gimli, Manitoba, however, where a deep filial respect for ancestral tradition courses through local veins, the story of Snorri and Snæbjorn met with both chuckles and tacit credulity. True or not, Christiansen's tale gave new life to the campaign, helping secure much-needed government funding. As a complement to his marketing efforts, Gimli writer Kathy Hurlbert, née Arneson, and illustrator Jerry Johnson dramatized his fairy tale in a children's book entitled The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk, in which Snorri and Snæbjorn are portrayed as large-eared, elf-like creatures with colorful scarves and tall, floppy hats. By 1994, a corps of volunteers under the auspices of the Gimli Municipal Heritage Committee were busy restoring the old schoolhouse. Led by Christiansen himself, who, despite suffering from Parkinson's disease, served as head of the building committee, the volunteers spent a collective 30,000 hours and $350,000 worth of government grants rebuilding the walls, rewiring the electrical system, replacing the furnace, installing new flooring, building a new staircase, and making cosmetic touch-ups inside the historic building. According to Christiansen, the renovation project awakened the dormant Snorri and Snæbjorn, who had enjoyed sole occupancy of the schoolhouse since its closing in 1975. They have great rapport with children, who are more likely to see them than adults, he said of the Huldufolk in an interview, adding that the elusive pranksters had recently stolen the boots he kept at the worksite. In an effort to appease the little people, he and the volunteers reserved the attic for their use, furnishing it with a tiny bed and other suitably small accessories. In 1996, the refurbished schoolhouse was converted into Gimli's multi-purpose community centre. The municipality moved its administrative offices into the Heritage Building, turning half of the schoolhouse into an unorthodox town hall. Other vacant rooms were employed as social service offices, a museum, and an art gallery. The attic remained, and remains to this day, the domain of Snorri and Snæbjorn, in which local children are encouraged to leave drawings and written messages for their town's most elusive residents. To this day, there is no real consensus in Gimli as to whether Christensen's tale was merely the product of his imagination, his enduring refusal to concede its fantastical nature being a manifestation of the droll, deadpan sarcasm which seems to characterize Scandinavian humor, or whether it had some kernel of truth at its core. Many, of course, dismiss Christensen's story as a well-intentioned fib, and with good reason. There is some evidence suggesting that the former university president was a strong believer in the importance of stimulating childhood imagination, and that he was not beyond inventing tall tales in an effort to achieve that purpose. According to Manitoban creative communication student Josh Kerr, in an article he published on his website in December 2015, Lorna Tyrgeson, the owner of Tyrgeson's General Store, told him that Christensen, quote, said he was really sorry that he allowed Kathy Hurlbert to make images of Snorri and Snæbjorn in her book, strongly believing that every child should have their own imagination of the little people, unquote. Another blogger who purports to be a Gimli native wrote the following on her website. One of my clearest memories from childhood is being at the bottom of the small spiraling staircase that leads to the high school attic, with my grandmother and Leo Christensen. Mr. Christensen let me feel a bump on his head, which he told me came from the brick the Huldafolk threw, unquote. Assuming that this memory is accurate, and that the brick to which the blogger referred is the famous piece of ornamental limestone which fell from the school in 1975, Christensen's disclosure to the author appears to be a fabrication concocted for the youngster's benefit. Dr. Christensen was 43 years old when the aforementioned stone fell, living in the city of Saskatoon, where he was beginning his first term as vice president of the University of Saskatchewan. Despite that the saga of Snorri and Snæbjorn seems to be little more than a product of Leo Christensen's imagination, some Gimli residents believe to this day that their town, and the old schoolhouse in particular, is haunted by Huldafolk. According to 29-year-old Brittany Isfeld, a lifelong Gimli resident whom Josh Kerr interviewed for his aforementioned article, quote, the sound of giggling and footsteps as if they're running around, unquote, can sometimes be heard emanating from the old building's attic, invariably when the tape recorder is out of reach. Similarly, in Season 1, Episode 6 of the Canadian TV series Exhibit A, filmmakers Frank Wolf and Ted McPhee conducted a small impromptu survey on the streets of Gimli, in which 38% of participants expressed the belief that they share their town with the hidden people of Icelandic Canadian legend. Another Canadian ethnocultural group with a traditional belief in little people are the Kashubian Canadians of the Madawaska Highlands, the latter being a quiet rural area in southern Ontario east of Algonquin Provincial Park. Kashubia, the historic homeland of Kashubian Canadians, is a region in northwestern Poland which hugs the shores of the Baltic Sea. Kashubians, the historic inhabitants of Kashubia, are descendants of a medieval Slavic tribe whose members were known as Pomeranians, who speak their own regional dialect and whose unique traditional culture distinguishes them from their Polish neighbors. In 1858, when Kashubia was part of the German Kingdom of Prussia, hundreds of poor, hard-working Kashubians left their homeland for Canada, hoping to build better lives for themselves and their families in the Great White North. Most of these immigrants settled along the Opeongo Line, a colonization road freshly blazed through the forests of the Madawaska Highlands, along which the British Canadian government was offering free land at the time. The settlements which these immigrants founded, foremost among them being Wilno, Barry's Bay, and Round Lake Center, boast high populations of Kashubian Canadians to this very day. In 1968, a young Harvard-educated linguist named Jan Louis Perkowski interviewed 15 elderly Kashubian Canadians from Wilno in an effort to investigate a rumor that certain residents of that quiet rural community harbored a traditional belief in vampires. He outlined his findings in a controversial paper entitled Vampires, Dwarves, and Witches Among the Ontario Kashubs. Amid tales of vampires, witches, and succubae, Perkovsky's paper includes stories of supernatural dwarves, whom Kashub Canadians traditionally believed inhabited their barns, stables, and farmhouses. Dwarves are domestic daemons, Perkovsky began in his introduction to the subject, whose dispositions are not all bad. In habit and physique, they resemble human beings, except that they are very small. They wear red suits and red caps, unquote. The dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands were said to be mischievous entities, who sometimes perpetrated pranks on the farmers on whose properties they squatted. The most common of these was their practice of braiding horses' manes and tails at night, creating inextricable tangles which, in other traditions, have been called fairy locks and witches' knots. "Oh yes," said one of Perkovsky's informants in reference to this troublesome dwarfish courtesy. "About those dwarves, we were very much afraid of them. They told various stories about how the dwarf came, braided the horse. They so braided it that it was impossible to unbraid it. I still remember how our horses had it," unquote. "My father went to the stable," said another informant, recalling an incident from his childhood. "The horses' manes were tangled, and they said that the dwarves must have done it. We were afraid to go to the stable," unquote. Other manifestations of dwarfish activity are circular rings of dead grass or scorched earth, which sometimes appear around farmhouses, which were said to be spots in which dwarves had danced. One of Perkovsky's interviewees remembered, quote, "seeing a circle as wide as a horseplow, in which nothing grew for over 5 years," unquote. Another informant recalled seeing a similar ring outside her neighbor's granary. Although perhaps most strongly reminiscent of the infamous crop circles so often concomitant with UFO sightings, these circular patches of scorched earth also evoke a naturally occurring phenomenon called fairy rings, circular patches in fields and meadows filled with or fringed by either dead grass, dark green grass, or mushrooms. Another sign that a farm had been visited by dwarves was a reduction in a cow's milk yield. Kashubian Canadian tradition contends that dwarves would sometimes milk their cows in the night. According to one of Perkovsky's informants, a Kashubian Canadian woman was once approached by a dwarf with a pail while she was in the process of milking her cow. The little fellow came from somewhere in the barn, the informant said, and asked her to give some of the milk for his sick child, unquote. The interviewee neglected to disclose whether or not the milkmaid complied with the request. The most sinister trick in the dwarves' playbook, according to Perkovsky's informants, involved stealing a human infant and replacing it with one of their own malformed dwarf children. According to one old-timer whom Perkovsky interviewed, a dwarf had attempted to do this to an infant born to one of the first Kashubian Canadian families to settle in the Madawaska Valley. The kidnapper-to-be was caught in the act, and its plan was thwarted. Another dwarf, according to another informant, prevailed in its endeavors, successfully swapping its deformed baby with that of a local family while the child's mother was working in the field. It was evident that the child was changed, the informant said. In an effort to lure the tiny perpetrator back to her home so that she could force it to remedy its offense, the mother devised a trap involving a boot and a piece of meat. The mother successfully trapped the dwarf and gave it a thrashing, prompting it to repossess its own changeling and return the human child safe and sound. Although supposed evidences of dwarfish activity like fairy rings and fairy locks could potentially be attributable to natural phenomena, actual sightings of little people in the Madawaska Highlands are more difficult to explain away. One of Perkovsky's informants claimed that some people he knew had seen a group of small, red-clad people dancing in a circle by the riverside while they were fishing one Good Friday. Another interviewee claimed that, when she was a child, she peered through a small hole on a hollow log on which she sat and spied a tiny woman hiding therein. "I kept looking at her and was very much afraid," she said. "She had a hat and a nice dress, and wore shorts with buttons," unquote. The informant called her mother over, but by the time she arrived, the little person had disappeared. Other interviewees claimed to have heard dwarves without seeing them. One claimed that mysterious sobbing, perhaps the lamentations of a dwarf, erupted from behind her kitchen stove when a member of her household announced the passing of a friend. Another related a story that his uncle told him about dwarves who would emerge from a particular rock atop a treeless hill on certain Sunday nights to sing, dance, and play music on tiny violins. "They could hear, you know, the dwarves," he said, "but we were not able to see them," unquote. The French-Canadian habitants who farmed their narrow seigneuries along the shores of the St. Lawrence River throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had their own little people legends, many elements of which they share in common with the dwarf lore of the Madawaska Highlands. The name that the French-Canadian farmers applied to their diminutive neighbors was lutin, a word which roughly translates to goblin. Two of the best sources on this all-but-forgotten piece of French-Canadian folklore are 19th century writers Honoré Beaugrand and Louis-Honoré Frechette, radical French-Canadian nationalists and friends famous for their contes, or fictional stories, based on old French-Canadian folk tales. Beaugrand wrote an academic-style discourse on the legend of the lutin in his article The Goblin Lore of French Canada, a chapter in his 1904 Ethnology, New Studies of Canadian Folklore. Frechette, on the other hand, incorporated the legend into his French-language short story Les Lutins, or The Goblins, a tongue-in-cheek comedy which was published in the 1905 issue of the Almanach de People de la Librairie Bouchemont. Similar to Washington Irving's famous short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in which the spectral headless horseman who confronts the protagonist in the climax is strongly implied to be the latter's human nemesis in disguise, the gullible narrator of Frechette's story encounters a lutin, who is implied to actually be an illusory projection of his own superstitions onto the antics of a mischievous co-worker. According to Beaugrand, quote, "It is evident that the goblin lore of Canada was imported from France," unquote, and that there were very few differences between Canadian lutin lore and its French progenitor, aside from, quote, "things connected with the difference in climatic or geological surroundings," unquote. The word lutin itself, he argued, most probably derives from an ancient Saxon word meaning little, since, quote, "the most distinguishing characteristic of the lutin is its diminutive size," unquote. Frechette, perhaps indulging in a little literary license, elaborated on the creature's physical appearance in his short story, describing them as, quote, "little men, 18 inches tall, with nothing but a single eye in the middle of their foreheads, with noses like hazelnuts, a bullfrog's mouth split up to the ears, arms like toad's feet, with bellies like tomatoes and big pointed hats that make them look like spring mushrooms. The eye that they have in the middle of their foreheads glows like a burning coal, and that's what lights them up, because these folks sleep during the day and come out at night to cause mischief, you know," unquote. Lutins attach themselves to particular households, on the grounds of which, according to Frechette, they abide, quote, "in the earth, behind stumps, between rocks, and especially in the stables, because if they have a penchant for anything, it's for horses," unquote. In the French-speaking parishes of the province of Quebec, Beaugrand wrote, "The lutins are considered as mischievous, fun-loving little spirits," unquote, which either annoy or confer luck upon their inadvertent landlords, quote, "according to the treatment that they receive from the inmates of the house where they have chosen to dwell," unquote. In return for good treatment, lutins, quote, "will procure good weather for the crops, they will watch over favorite animals, and they will intercede for the recovery of the sick members of the household, attaching themselves to favorite children and guiding them safely through the infantine maladies of their tender years," unquote. If treated poorly by the residents of their chosen abodes, lutins will subject their human neighbors to, quote, "a long series of annoyances and persecutions of all kinds," unquote. These tricks include, but are not limited to, filling boots with peas or pebbles, sewing pant legs shut at the knees, mixing salt or pepper into tea, replacing food with stones, and tampering with tools. The lutins of French Canada seem to take a special interest in horses. "When it comes to tending horses," Frechette wrote, "there are no stablemen to match them. When they take a liking to a horse, its manger is always full, and you wouldn't believe how its coat shines. Its mane and tail are as dainty as any dolled-up pet," unquote. Conversely, if a lutin is upset with a farmer, its delight is to take revenge on his favorite horse. Like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, the vengeful lutin will spend the night twisting the hair of a horse's mane and tail into hopeless tangles. Sometimes he will take the horse out for a long, hard nocturnal gallop through the wilderness, eventually returning the animal to its stall exhausted, lathered in sweat, and covered with burrs and thistles. According to Beaugrand, there are two methods by which farmers can protect themselves from the wiles of the unhappy lutin. One is to pour a line of salt across the threshold of a home and the entrance to a stable, since, quote, "lutins have a holy horror for salt, and cannot pass where that condiment has been strewn in their way," unquote. If a lutin continues to commit its misdeeds despite this precaution, the only recourse is to kill and skin two cats, one of them pure black and the other pure white, cut the skins into strips, and use the strips to create a lattice screen for the doors and windows of the building in which the pranks occur. Undoubtedly, the deepest-rooted, best-documented, and most enduring Little People tradition in all of Canada is the fairy lore of Newfoundland. Imported to the Rock from Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and especially southeastern Ireland and southwestern England, this legacy of Celtic folklore bears many similarities to its Icelandic Canadian, Kashubian Canadian, and French Canadian cousins. Like the Lutins of French Canada, for example, the fairies of Newfoundland were said to take farmers' horses for nightly rides, and tamper with their manes and tails. Like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, they were believed to milk cows from time to time, and were said to be occasionally spotted dancing in circles hand in hand. Unlike these other Canadian traditions, however, in which Little People were said to be inclined to attach themselves to farmhouses and rural settlements, Newfoundland fairy lore designates the wilderness the primary domain of the Little People. Another characteristic which sets Newfoundland fairy lore apart from its Canadian counterparts is the nature of the relationship which it contends exists between the Little People and humans. The fairies of Newfoundland are said to be almost entirely malevolent, enjoying a purely parasitic association with the humans who trespass on their territory. Newfoundland settlers were so afraid of offending these little malicious entities, lest they make themselves the objects of their mischief, that they paradoxically referred to them, in the infrequent fireside conversations which their terror would allow, as the Good People. One of the most authoritative sources on Newfoundland fairy lore is Californian folklorist Dr. Barbara Rietti's 1991 book, Strange Terrain: The Fairy World in Newfoundland. Rietti's book is essentially a curated selection of student-collected stories from the Memorial University of Newfoundland Folklore and Language Archive, or MUNFLA, supplemented by Rietti's own fieldwork and analysis. In her book, Rietti identifies a handful of alleged fairy hotspots, almost all of them located on the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland's southeastern corner. Many of these cluster along the shores of the predominantly English Protestant Conception Bay, which furrows Avalon's northern face, while many more dot Avalon's southerly Irish Catholic-heavy bays and harbors. Most of these hotspots are characterized by forest, marshland, berry patches, or sparsely vegetated barrens, all of these features being favorite fairy haunts, and are home to natural features with names like Fairy Ridge, Fairy Hill, and Fairy Marsh. Newfoundland fairies are said to delight in disorienting lone travelers who trespass on their territory, creating optical illusions which lead their victims off the beaten path and deeper into the wilderness. Their ultimate aim is to draw their human prey into their own other-dimensional realm, trapping them in the fairies, as Newfoundland vernacular terms the shadowy plane in which they dwell. In her book, Rietti includes a tale of a man from Bell Island, an alleged fairy hotspot situated at the southeastern end of Conception Bay, who claimed to have walked into one of these fairy traps while heading down a familiar trail through the forest. As he was crossing a path that he usually crossed, wrote the man's nephew, who recorded the story, quote, "He saw trees that were never there before. The trees were about 50 or 60 feet high. He went down the road a ways and then went back again. He did this 3 times, and the 3rd time he went back, everything was back to normal," unquote. Another man from Southern Shore, at the eastern end of the Avalon Peninsula, is said to have been walking on a well-beaten path through the forest outside the town of Firmoose, quote, when he sensed that he was walking on unfamiliar ground. All around him were high trees, the height of which he had never seen before. Then he began to curse and swear, and in the madness at having lost his way, took off his cap and flung it to the ground. Immediately, he was on the correct path again, unquote. A man named Roland O'Connor, who hailed from the town of Placentia on the Avalon Peninsula's western shore, claimed to have suffered a similar experience on October 1st, 1925. Roland spent that day hunting with his brother Ralph, but found little in the way of game. Hoping to bag something before the end of the day, he decided to head out for one last ramble that evening. Shortly after he left camp, his dog suddenly began to whine. His horse quickly followed suit, breaking into a nervous whinny without any apparent cause. At that moment, Roland spotted 2 black ducks in the underbrush, which he promptly shot. Thinking that the fowls must have somehow been the cause of his animal's mysterious agitation, the hunter made to retrieve the birds. Suddenly, a babble of unintelligible voices erupted all around him, muttering words he could not make out. Startled, he whirled around to find himself in an unfamiliar setting, surrounded by tall trees, cliffs, and large boulders. the bewildered hunter began to pick his way through the new terrain, wandering aimlessly without any familiar landmark to guide him. He continued his journey as darkness descended. When his tired legs would carry him no further, the hunter fired 13 shots with his rifle into the air, hoping that the sound would lead Ralph to his location. That accomplished, he sat down and waited for morning. At dawn, Roland found himself sitting on the familiar game trail on which he had set out the night before, a mere mile from camp. He reunited with his brother, who told him that he had spent half the night looking for him. He never heard any of Roland's gunshots despite their close proximity, and had fired 10 or 12 shots himself, none of which Roland perceived. Later on in her book, Rieti included a short Munfla entry collected from a man from the community of Lumsden, on the northernmost lip of Bonavista Bay, the latter being a remote body of water north of the Avalon Peninsula. The informant claimed that his father had once disappeared while scouting out berry bushes. His friends searched for him for hours, and finally found him walking around in a circle, apparently in some kind of trance. When they shouted at him, he stopped in his tracks, immediately freed from the strange spell that had gripped him. As soon as he did, the informant said, he told his friends that he had been in Fairyland, and he couldn't get out no matter how hard he tried. He said the fairies had been holding him captive. As soon as he came out of this trance, he recognized where he was and walked out with his friends. There are several methods by which travelers can protect themselves from being taken by the fairies. The most common of these is to carry a piece of bread in one's pocket. Instead of attempting to kidnap the human, the fairies will direct their efforts towards stealing the bread. Other protective measures include sprinkling oneself with holy water before going out, wearing clothing inside out, turning pockets inside out, and not wearing green-colored clothing, green being a color of special importance to the fairies. If a traveler actually sees a host of fairies in the wilderness, he can prevent the good people from doing mischief to him by tossing pieces of bread to them, making the sign of the cross, or praying on his knees. Legend has it that if someone is successfully captured by the fairies, the little people will offer him or her fairy food, which is said to be always devoid of salt. Those who eat this food will remain trapped among the fairies forever. Those who steadfastly refuse to eat fairy food may eventually be returned to civilization, although perhaps not in the same state as the one in which they had been prior to their capture. This facet of Newfoundland fairy lore eerily evokes the legend of the Bakwas, or Wild Man of the Woods, a supposed being of Kwakwaka'wakw tradition, said to haunt the forests and streams of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Legend has it that the Bakwas attempts to persuade humans to eat ghost food, which will transform them into beings like himself. Optical illusions aren't the only artifices which fairies employ in their efforts to capture human travelers. These mischievous beings are also said to physically drag people, especially children and teenagers, to fairyland by conjuring strong winds. If a strong wind picks up suddenly and unexpectedly on the island, many old Newfoundlanders will suspect it to be the work of the fairies. There are two methods by which humans can prevent themselves from being carried off by fairy winds. The first is to throw a rock or some other gift in the direction in which the wind is blowing. The second is to repeat the full name of the abductee to be backwards. For example, if a boy named John Smith is in the process of being blown away by a fairy wind, his abduction can be halted if he or someone near him repeats the words, "Smith John, Smith John." One startling account of a fairy wind appears in the Munfla files, furnished by the subject's granddaughter. Her father and herself were picking flowers in a field back of their house on the southern shore, the story goes, when the little girl was picked up and swept across the meadow at a very fast pace. She wasn't touching the ground, but the heels of her feet brushed the daisies as she swept past. The father turned to see his youngest daughter taken away by the fairies, as he suspected, and yelled the girl's name backwards 3 times. Immediately, the spell was broken, and the young child was placed on the ground without harm. Since that time, she has had special powers, predictability, an ability to read tea leaves, ESP, all unnatural, but stemming possibly from her being taken away that afternoon in the meadow, unquote. Not every Newfoundlander to have a brush with the fairies is as fortunate as the subjects of the aforementioned stories. Many disappear forever, never to be seen again. The fairies may leave some article of their clothing behind as a sign that they are with them in fairyland. Others are later found dead in the wilderness, often in places that have been previously scoured by search parties. Sometimes these corpses are found with prematurely white hair, hinting at the possibility that the victims suffered some terrible supernatural shock at the time of their deaths. Some of those believed to have been taken by fairies eventually return to civilization days, weeks, or months after their abductions. Almost invariably, these survivors return from fairyland inalterably changed in some way, usually for the worse. Most of these unfortunates suffer from extreme personality changes or mental disabilities. Abductees who are naturally talkative and outgoing may return taciturn and antisocial. Some develop speech impediments, while others lose the ability to speak entirely. Many are later committed to asylums. Nearly all either refuse to or are unable to describe their time among the fairies. In addition to mental maladies, some survivors return to civilization bearing deformities or suffering from crippling physical disabilities. Others look subtly, undefinably, yet undeniably different than their former selves. Many die prematurely, often a year or two after their return, bringing the secrets of fairyland with them to the grave. There is no consensus in Newfoundland as to the cause of the changes seen in fairy abductees. Many believe that the survivors return under the influence of some sinister fairy spell, administered for the purpose of preventing the abductee from revealing the fairy's secrets. Some suspect that the magic of the fairies is too powerful for mortals to sustainably endure. Those touched briefly by the fairies, like the girl who was nearly carried away by the wind, may develop uncanny fairy-like abilities, but those saturated in fairy magic will sustain permanent and irreversible damage. Others suspect returnees to be possessed by fairy spirits, while others still believe them to be fairies themselves, disguised in human form, aping the behavior of the humans they have decided to replace. Whatever the case, most variations of Newfoundland folklore agree that the changes affecting fairy abductees seem to visibly disappear at death. One of the most famous Newfoundland fairy men, as returnees from fairyland are sometimes called, was Davy Mercer, a boy who disappeared one day on Bell Island in the 1920s. According to one informant whose account lies in the Munfla files, quote, "My grandfather told me of a fairy happening that he had seen himself. One day in the early 1920s, Poppy and his friends were playing near the woods. They were afraid to go in the woods because they had been warned of the fairies. Suddenly, they heard a giggling noise, one that sounded very unusual. Poppy and his friends ran as fast as they could to the nearest house. When they got there, they realized that one of the boys was missing. They were afraid to go back and look for him. Instead, they went to the Mercer home and told Davy's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer gathered up a few more older folks and began to look for Davy. They had no luck in finding him. It was a week or so when he found his own way home. His parents were shocked. Their darling little boy, who was completely normal before, was now practically deformed. They pulled sticks, rocks, and things from the lumps in their son's skin. Davy was now mentally and physically disturbed. From that time onward, he was never the same. As he grew older, he became stranger. He walked around crippled, wearing a long coat and a top hat. He always carried a briefcase and tried to sell things. However, no one ever saw what was inside the briefcase. Another Munfla informant elaborated on the case of Davy Mercer, writing, quote, "I still persisted to question my father as a non-believer of fairies. He next told me about a man who I personally had known. He was a Mr. David Mercer, who had lived on Bell Island. He was a short, thin man. He walked with a limp. His face was very white and wrinkled. His speech was not a stutter or stammer, but a mixture of the two. And he had a perpetual grin, which was horrifying. He was a very awkward and even frightening individual. To see this person would quickly lead one to believe that he had experienced a great shock of some sort. That look of terror was painted on his face." Dad explained what happened to turn a perfectly normal man into such a horrible specimen, unquote. After relating the story of Mercer's abduction, which differs slightly from that furnished by the aforementioned informant, the writer claimed that Davy was, quote, "found curled up by a tree in a fit of terror. He was crying and mumbling, his clothes were torn, and he seemed to be in pain. Many of the people who were present when he was found believe it to be the work of the fairies," unquote. Another Munfla tale which Rieti includes in her book is that of Jack McCall, a farmer from the village of Colliers, who was interviewed in 1989 at the age of 80. McCall recalled an incident which took place when he was a young man. He and his sister went out to collect tree branches when they found a local woman named Bride Hall raking a pile of hay into a cart. And all of a sudden, he said, this squall of wind come and rolled up the pooks together, took them all in one, unquote. Incredibly, Bride Hall flew away with the hay. Jack and his sister ran home and informed their mother of the incident. Although their mother was skeptical, she and her sister, Mary, headed down to the field to investigate. Sure enough, Bride Hall was nowhere to be found. A thorough search ensued, but without avail. It was as if Bride Hall had disappeared into thin air. 3 days later, the searchers found Bride Hall sitting beside a body of water called Three Island Pond, casually knitting a pair of stockings. "So, where'd you get the needles?" McCall asked. "Where'd you get the wool to knit a stocking?" Unquote. Bride Hall spent the next 7 years bedridden, and refused to tell a soul what had happened to her in the 3 days which succeeded her disappearance. Another disturbing tale of fairy abduction was told by an old man from Perry's Cove, located on the western edge of the Avalon Peninsula's northernmost finger, whose interviewer submitted the tale to the Munfla Files. In 1932, when the informant was 16 years old, a little girl of about 9 years veered off the beaten path while tobogganing with some of her friends. Her sled carried her into a nearby marsh. Several men who were working in the area heard her frantic cries and hurried to help her, the informant said, although a short interval elapsed before she was reached. No amount of persuasion could coax her away, and finally physical force had to be employed while she kept crying out that she wanted to go back. They brought her to a priest, who blessed her, and tried to allay her hysteria, but she was never really the same afterwards. You couldn't get her to say anything, and she even had to be told to sit down, otherwise she would remain standing, and staring vacantly before her. She was just a young woman when she died, only in her 30s, and in all that time she never got any better, unquote. If Newfoundland fairies only played their tricks on those who encroached upon their privacy, people who hoped to avoid their pernicious attentions could do so simply by steering clear of bogs, barrens, forests, hills, berry patches, and other locales believed to be popular fairy haunts. Unfortunately, Newfoundland fairies are said to sometimes invade human abodes to torment their inmates. The houses most commonly subjected to these unwanted intrusions are those built on so-called fairy paths, thoroughfares which fairies follow when conducting their funerals. Legend has it that on certain foggy nights, especially on October 1st, October 31st, November 2nd, and May 1st, fairies can be seen marching solemnly in file along these fairy paths, carrying the coffins of their dead. Those who witness these funerary processions, who wish to preserve their sanity, are advised to avert their gaze, cover their ears, and inconspicuously leave the vicinity of the path. The best preventative measure people can take to avoid being harassed by fairies in their own homes is to leave some refreshments, specifically bread and water or milk, on the kitchen table or on the doorstep overnight. Fairies who enter the home at night will always avail themselves of this hospitality, leaving their involuntary hosts in peace. Another good practice is to refrain from whistling at night, as fairies are said to be attracted to nocturnal music. The most heinous crime committed by Newfoundland fairies involves stealing human infants from their cradles, usually when their mothers are not watching them, and replacing them with their own changelings. Grotesque, impish, baby-like beings that have faces like elderly men. These changelings rarely live long in their new environments, and when they die, their appearances revert back to those of the original children they replaced. There are several methods by which parents who find changelings in their babies' cribs can coerce the fairies to return their real children. The most effective of these is to thrust a shovel into the fire, wait until the blade is red hot, and approach the monstrous infant with the glowing implement. This prompts the changeling to abandon the cradle and flee out the nearest door or window, and the fairies to return the real baby. Parents unwilling to take this desperate measure can treat their infants' gruesome substitutes with extraordinary warmth and kindness. If the changeling receives sufficient affection, the fairies may return the original child out of gratitude. One elderly Newfoundland woman named Angela Mason told several changeling stories to an enterprising folklorist, who submitted her accounts to the Munfla archive. One of these, involving a family she knew personally, unfolds thus. Quote, "My mother, you know, she was from the Golds. The people who lived next door had a baby boy, and he was swapped. He was only a little baby, but he was starting to look just like an old man. The woman's brother used to live there with them too. He kept telling her the baby was swapped and wanted to redden the shovel to throw him out, but she wouldn't hear of it. One day she was in town and there was nobody home, only this brother and the baby. This was his chance. He reddened the shovel in the fireplace and brought it to the side of the crib. Just as he did, the baby flew right up out of the crib and out through the window, and he chasing it with a shovel. When he came back, the real baby was back in the crib." Unquote. The following is another Newfoundland changeling story collected by a folklorist named Wayne Lee Stephenville. Quote, "Alice Ryan was born a nice child, but at 2 or 3 weeks of age got cross and ugly, and showed behavior inconsistent with a child of that age. Mrs. Cook was an old woman who lived in Mussel Pond, a community some distance from Riverhead, and the acknowledged authority on supernatural events. 3 people from the community of Riverhead set out on the considerable journey cross-country to eventually arrive at Mrs. Cook's house with the baby, and find 3 cups of tea waiting for them. Mrs. Cook, when presented with the child, said, 'Give me that,' threw the child in the bedroom, put a shovel in the stove to heat, and invited her 3 visitors to sit down to tea. When tea was finished and the shovel was red hot, Mrs. Cook went into the bedroom, from which emerged loud cries and shrieking, and a noise such as the side was coming out of the house. Then, after a short period of quiet, Mrs. Cook emerged with a cute baby to announce that all was well." Unquote. Newfoundland tradition contends that parents can protect their infants from being swapped by the fairies by placing breadcrumbs in their cribs. Prospective fairy kidnappers who approach the crib will steal these morsels and leave the baby unharmed. Another effective precaution is to place the infant's crib away from the window, and to ensure that all the windows in the house remain shut. There is no universal consensus in Newfoundland as to the fairies' essential nature or physical appearance. One old Irish Newfoundlandic tradition contends that the fairies are angels who failed to take sides in the war in heaven, a celestial battle which, according to Christian tradition, was fought at the dawn of time, the combatants being the heavenly host loyal to God, captained by Saint Michael the Archangel, and the rebellious fallen angels, who pledged allegiance to Lucifer. As punishment for their infidelity, God banished the neutral angels to earth, to a twilight realm between heaven and hell, and promised them that they would be the last to enter paradise on Judgment Day. Legend has it that their assurance of an eventual place in heaven is the only thing preventing the fairies from venting their frustration upon the earth and wiping out its human inhabitants. According to Barbara Rietti, quote, "The fairies are protean beings, appearing here in one form, there another, sometimes changing right before a person's eyes." Unquote. Some Newfoundlanders who claim to have seen fairies describe them as tiny beings no taller than 1.5 feet. Most contend that they are the same size as children, while a few believe them to be as large as ordinary human adults. While some ascribe the fairies with youthful, childlike features, others maintain that their countenances are withered and ancient-looking. Alleged fairy witnesses have furnished many different descriptions of the clothing worn by the little people they encountered. Some fairies have been seen wearing green robes, while others were garbed entirely in grey. Some wore blue suits, while others affected green and red motley. A few are said to have been clad in lily-white raiment, evocative of certain Huldufolk stories, while others were dressed all in red, like the dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands. Despite the many different descriptions of fairy attire, one remarkable consistency is a red stocking cap, which nearly every alleged fairy witness claimed adorned the crania of the little people into which they stumbled. It is tempting to dismiss the little people stories of New Iceland, the Madawaska Highlands, the St. Lawrence Valley, and the island of Newfoundland as mere remnants of Old World folklore, which European settlers imported into the continent, the product of our less sophisticated ancestors' attempt to make sense of the nuisances, tragedies, and bizarre phenomena for which they had no rational explanation. This comforting idea is challenged by the fact that many First Nations and Native American tribes have little people stories of their own, which bear remarkable similarities to their European counterparts. I touched on the northernmost of these legends in my video, Elves from the North Pole, which includes excerpts from my 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley. Conversely, my friend Mateo, whom you may remember from my video on the Wendigo of Pikes Peak, Colorado, just published an excellent video on similar native legends from the southwestern United States on his own YouTube channel, Modern Explorer, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.